I think I posted this out, and I posted this call as the pharmacist who gave up drugs. And I think that's a provocative title in a way, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really, and it certainly piques the interest. But tell us, so you've had a major change in direction.
Yeah.
So tell me about how that happened.
Yeah. So we all have our personal journey, don't we?
Mm.
And I grew up steeped in the same orthodoxy that I'm sure you grew up in. Calories in, calories out. Fat makes you fat. Cholesterol's going to kill you, and all the rest of it. And I started off with one community pharmacy, ended up building a group of 10 with a national reputation, became very senior in my profession. I was on the board of the National Pharmacy Association and ultimately on the Council of the Pharmaceutical Society, when that body was both the professional regulator and the professional representative body, and quite rapidly realised that those two roles are completely in conflict. And as a result, we've completely restructured the entire profession, both from an educational perspective and from a representative and regulatory perspective. So we now have the GPHC, which is the equivalent of the GMC for doctors, and the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, which is the equivalent of the Academy of Royal Colleges. And I was always very interested in advanced practice, and actually in many ways took my inspiration from my general practice colleagues. So you will not find a greater supporter of general practice, not uncritical supporter, but a passionate supporter of general practice at its best, than me. And we modelled our group of pharmacists on a really high performing GP practice. And I've done lots of work with GPs, and a lot of that came about because of my national role. So I got to know the Royal College, I got to know the BMA, and I got to meet some absolutely inspirational medics. And my observation is that you can go to a GP practice, high performing GP practice, 5 doctors working in complete synergy, doing really interesting stuff with excellent practice management, providing fantastic services to patients, and having a ball. And you could go down the road, 5 miles down the road, to an identical private doctor practice, and what you've got is 5 individuals practicing in the same building who hate each other, never communicate, with poor practice management, poor morale, and pretty indifferent services. Well, you can say, well, so what? And the so what is this: when we built up our group of 10 pharmacies, I realised that with modern communications that you could produce a group practice. Because to be honest, whether you're in the clinical room next door to each other or on the end of an email comes to the same thing. So we modelled what was the Man Pharmacy Group of 10 on a high performing GP practice. As again, a lot of my inspirations come from GPs. Went on to
Sometimes, Graham, those two very different GP practices can be within the same building
I
as
know,
well.
I know.
And I don't have to go too far from here to be able to say I've worked as a locum in 2 of those practices, and they couldn't be more different on the dividing line in the center of the building. So I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Without getting too deep into the weeds,
Mm.
that is why a lot of these strategies will fail, because it presupposes that all these competing businesses, because GPs are to an extent competing businesses, will work together, and that they'll collaboratively, come together within an area. And in some areas that works very well, but you can't guarantee it. Anyway, back at the pharmacy. So having done all of that, having become very senior in the profession, having then done lots of advanced practice, we won numerous awards. So we've won pretty much every pharmacy award, and most of them twice, and I'm immensely proud of that. But ultimately, I got very frustrated, both on a personal level and on a professional level. So on a personal level, I knew what to do. I took all the right advice, and I got hungrier and fatter and fatter and hungrier, and I'd had that problem since I was a kid. So here I was, aged mid-40s, getting fatter and hungry, doing everything that I was supposed to do, and none of it working, and simultaneously professionally winning all these awards. And what started me on a new path actually was Michael Mosley's 5-2 diet. And I saw the original Horizon program, Eat Fast and Live Longer, thought, oh, I can do that. Adopted the diet and very rapidly lost 10 kilos. And when I thought about it, I thought, well, none of this calories in, calories out thing and this eat less, move more thing has played out for me. And I want to re-explore the fundamental science. And I realised that everything I thought I knew was all wrong. And I also realise now that we health professionals all get fantastic education, but end up in a kind of backwater of, it's all about the use of medication and the suppression of symptoms and nothing about prevention. So that set me on a new path. And I thought, well, let me re-explore the fundamental science here. Now, pharmacy is a very wide-ranging life science degree. So we learn molecular biology, we learn electron transport mechanisms, we know how cells work, how mitochondria work, all these kind of things. And so I went back and looked at the fundamental science and realised that a calorie isn't necessarily a calorie, and that actually you can't outrun a bad diet and all the rest of it. My next inspiration probably came from the Israeli research done at the Weizmann Institute. And what they did, this is Eran Siegel, and if you don't know Eran, he's a very interesting character. He's got a fantastic TED Talk. And what they basically did was they followed 1,000 people for a month, gave them a continual blood glucose monitor, and also did microbiome analysis. And what they were able to show is that the glycemic response, so let me come back to this. The glycemic index is the degree to which a particular food will raise your blood glucose. And in theory, so many slices of bread are the equivalent of so much potato, so much pizza, and so on and so forth, across 1,000 people. And in a population, we talk statistically about this thing called a bell-shaped curve. And it's based on that central average. The trouble is that this particular bell-shaped curve is very wide. And if you're on that end of the curve or that end of the curve, you get equal and opposite reactions to identical meals. And it transpires that what affects your individual glycemic response, this N=1 that we all talk about, is your microbiome. So it's not your genes, it's the genetic material in your gut, which incidentally outweighs the human genetic material by about 100 to 1. I then thought, okay, I've got all the pieces together. I understand the fundamental science. Let me try it. And I had a friend called Jeremy, and I can talk about Jeremy. I'm not betraying any patient confidentiality. He's one of the testimonials on my website. Mm-hmm. Jem and I went back from our youth. So I'd known him since he was mid-20s. He's now mid-50s. He's an engineer, serial entrepreneur, very wealthy, very successful guy, hypertensive. And this guy's been hypertensive for 30 years. Not particularly overweight, but hypertensive. Now, Jeremy being Jeremy, no mere GP was good enough. He was seeing one of the country's leading cardiologists. And he developed the hypertension in his sort of 30s. So he's seen the same cardiologist, who's incidentally now retired, for 20 years. And you will know, as I know, that the way we treat hypertension is we take the first drug, we titrate that drug up to the maximum that the drug or that the patient will tolerate. Then we add a second, then we add a third. Suffice it to say, Jeremy was taking 4 different medications now to control his blood pressure, the most recent of which they'd added doxazosin. Now, it was controlling his blood pressure, but he was getting horrible side effects. So I said, look, Jem, let's have a go at this. You'll love it being an engineer. Put the CGM on him. Next morning, huge blood glucose spike. Sent him a WhatsApp. What did you just have for breakfast? He said, all bran. I said, all bran, Jeremy, that is just a ton of sugar. And he said, well, what should I have for breakfast? And I said, well, have an omelette, cheese omelette one day, an avocado omelette the next, and so on and so forth. Within a month, he'd lost 10 kilos. Remember, no calorie counting, no diet, no other changes. He was probably eating more calories, if anything. And his blood pressure had come down into his boots. So he said, what do? I said, well, Jem, I could do a medicines use review, but go back and see the cardiologist. So by the time he got to see the cardiologist, it was a couple more weeks. So 6 weeks have gone by. He's now lost 12 kilos effortlessly. And the cardiologist, remember, he's seen the same guy for 20 years. And with every review, there's always been an increase in drugs or an increase in dose. And the guy says, immediately halves his antihypertensives and says, in my entire professional career, I've never seen anything like it. Right, we're now 3 years on. He's 23 kilos lighter,
Mm.
and the only medication he's still taking is a statin because I can't persuade him he doesn't need it.
Yeah.
Now, this is the beloved n equals one person,
Mm.
right? Means absolutely nothing to a scientist. But we tried it with different ages, different genders, different problems, and blow me down, I kept getting the same kind of results.
Mm.
Whether it was hypertension, whether it was diabetes, it was just astonishing. And I thought we're onto something here. And from that, we created the Prolongevity program,
Mhm.
which is now, well, cut a long story short, of the 10 pharmacies, I sold 7 of them
Mhm.
because I just don't find that fulfilling anymore, spooning tablets into people.
Yeah.
In fact, now I'm busy de-prescribing, getting people off the medication, saving the NHS a fortune. And it is so much more satisfying than any of the other things I've done, despite all the awards that we've won over that period of time. So that's a kind of potted history of my last 10 years in hopefully not more than 5 minutes.
No, absolutely. No, it's fascinating because I think it's one of the things I always, whenever I meet someone at a conference, I can't wait till we get to actually go back to some of these conferences and stuff because I find them really,
Absolutely.
really interesting. And when I meet somebody who's gone through a transformation, whether it be a physical kind of transformation that's led them to lose weight, or they've gone on a different career journey, as both you and I have, as a result of our journeys, and I know I'm sure we both know many other people in this industry, if you want to call it that have these things. So it's always fascinating to find out people's kind of aha moment,
Yeah.
and kind of what triggered them, and so yeah, it's really fascinating, and just the huge turnaround over, what we always, because I think our stories are similar but different, but you end up sitting there going, that's not what I thought it was.
Yeah.
How can I really continue this journey wholeheartedly that I was on before? Something's got to change.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really, really interesting. So I mean, obviously you run your program and stuff, and I chose to focus this one on weight loss, but we said we'd talk a bit about aging
Yeah.
in this talk, just to kind of, because I think that's a really, really interesting topic.
Yeah.
And with this, it's kind of come for the weight loss, stay for the health kind of side of things.
Yeah.
But also but it is really interesting to explore those different things. So what is aging well, in your opinion?
Well, I think aging well for me is my our kids are starting to have grandchildren. So
Congratulations.
aging well for me is being able to do all the same thing with my grandchildren that I used to be able to do with my kids.
Mm.
So it's being able to live a fully functional life, and I include within that sex life, which doesn't get discussed enough. But at the age of, when I was 30, I never thought people at 60 had sex.
Mm.
When you reach 60, you probably, as I am now, I realise that my sex life is as important to me as ever, and it's very much a vibrant part. And I want to get to 90 and still feel the same.
Mm.
So what I'm talking about is a fully functional life, the ability to do exactly the same stuff, and to have a complete relationship, and to, what does it say, to die young at a very old age, full functional.
Mm.
And I think that's entirely possible.
Mm.
And I think there's a whole new concept around aging, which perhaps we'll get into.
Mm. So how do we go about that? What are your kind of pillars of going about that? We talk about, start with diet, because I think it's the first point of commonality that we have, really, isn't it?
Yeah. So I'd like to start a little bit further back, if I may.
Go for it.
Is this?
Mm.
What's the oldest a man has ever fathered a child, do you reckon?
Now, are we talking Peter Stringfellow? Are we talking? I don't know.
Technically, men can go on fathering children. It's
Yeah.
happened, I think, into their 90s.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And what's the oldest a woman has ever naturally conceived? In her maybe 50s, mid 50s? It's acceptable.
Potentially. Yeah.
So their combined age is 140.
Mm.
But the baby comes out brand new. So somewhere inside us is the elixir of youth. And the journey is a bit like this. If you go back 30, 40 years, cancer was seen as an inevitable and random process about which you could do nothing, and once you got it, you were going to die. And these days, the majority of people live with cancer just like they live with all the other long-term conditions. It ultimately isn't the cause of their death in more than 50% of people. Now, if 40, 50 years ago, we'd all said nothing you can do about cancer, we'd have achieved nothing over that period. And there's a whole new concept of aging, which is aging as a disease rather than an inevitable consequence. And just to give a couple of other random examples, there's a tree that lives to 5,000 years old with no obvious signs of aging. And there's a whale that they found in the bottom of the ocean that's aged 500 and is not obviously aging. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that in all of biology, aging doesn't appear to be totally inevitable. And it also tells us that a mammal, and we're not a million miles away from a whale, can live to a tremendous age. So if you understood the process of aging and regard it as a disease process rather than some inevitable thing, what's out there? And what's out there might be potentially a life expectancy, a healthy, quality, vibrant life expectancy of 150 years. So that's what it. Now I'm 60. That means I'm only half done. I kind of quite fancy that.
Yeah.
So, okay. So if you start to understand the aging processes, you can then start to think about, okay, what things are going to enhance the rate of aging, and what things can I do that are going to reduce the rate of aging? And the example I would probably pick first is cardiometabolic disease, and in particular type 2 diabetes. Because in many ways you could say diabetes is premature aging. You can look at it in many different ways, but that's one way to look at it. And if you look at the things that contribute to diabetes, what are they? Well, overwhelmingly diet, and then things like stress, poor sleep, and a lack of exercise. All of the things that will go up to make my program, and I'm sure your program.
Yeah.
So then you might say, okay, well, let's look a bit more into the science. So of longevity, what's the contribution of your genes, and what's the contribution of everything else? In other words, are your genes your destiny?
Yeah.
And it turns out they're not. So although your genes might load the gun, it's your lifestyle that fires it. And healthy longevity is probably 80% lifestyle. How empowering is that?
Do you know what's really interesting, Graham, is you probably don't know this, but my first degree was medical genetics, and indeed, I must admit, so much of that's forgotten. But I did medical genetics up at Leicester University, and our Leicester University genetics department is famous for Professor Sir Alec Jeffreys, who invented DNA fingerprinting, and the first convictions were in Leicester, and I think one of the guys is just getting released at the moment. Actually, it's been in the news recently, and that's fundamentally DNA damage, because what they're looking for is DNA damage. So Professor Alec Jeffreys ran the DNA damage lab, and we talked a lot about aging and stuff at that moment. But this idea of epigenetics, this idea that the genes load the gun, but your lifestyle fired it, was not really talked about at the time. I was in 2000 to 2003, at the time when I was learning genetics. It was starting to be talked about, but it wasn't really being talked about. So this is, in the grand scheme of science, relatively new stuff, isn't it?
Very much new stuff. And of course, if you go back, I was a bit of a geeky kid, and I remember reading at the age of 13 Watson and Crick's original book on the discovery of the elucidation of the human genome, finding it fascinating. I was that kind of kid. And I think the human genome was finally elucidated more or less 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Of course, we're much more complicated. We've got about 22,000 genes. That's fewer genes than an earthworm or a banana, believe it or not. And what is astonishing about the human Homo sapiens, our species, is the way that we've managed to harness all the bugs in our gut, the microbiome. It's a colony of 2 to 3 kilograms of bugs. bacteria, fungi, eukaryotes, etc. And the bacteria seem to be the dominant species. The point is that the totality of our genetic makeup is only 1% our genes, it's 99% those bugs. And if anyone's really interested in that, I would recommend no one better than Professor Tim Spector, who's done fantastic studies.
Mhm.
So once you understand that the interplay here isn't just what goes on with your own genes, but also these, as I say, the 99% of you that's constituted by the bugs in your gut, everything becomes far more complicated, but far more interesting.
And talking of rapidly developing kind of areas of science, I've just got this Catherine Rogers on a
Yeah,
couple of last month. Some of
yeah,
you guys were here for Catherine's talk. I've just got this through the post actually, which is her book. But she was saying that since 2016, the amount of research that's come out about gut health and stuff is quite overwhelmingly significant boom over that period. And really 2016 was when my journey started. I'm
yeah,
still catching up on the on the gut health side of things.
yeah,
It's definitely a crazy growth area at the moment, isn't it? So
I think two things are going to revolutionize the practice in medicine the next decade. One is the huge role of insulin and retaining that, at its lowest level.
mm,
And as that affects all the cardiometabolic diseases, and the other one is the microbiome. And if you put those two together, I think the future looks incredibly optimistic, actually.
mm, mm. Yeah, absolutely. It's just the question is how to convince people of that. So
The
uh,
science, I think, will convince us. I mean, I don't.
well,
In the end, the science, the question is, I suppose, how long do we want to wait for the science to be accepted? And the example I always give is the smoking industry,
mm,
where the truth about the relationship between smoking and lung cancer had been known for 40, 50 years before it became mainstream and dealt with. And the same is absolutely true of sugar and processed food.
mm,
And if you take the sort of smoking industry playbook and ink out cigarettes and tobacco and put in sugar and processed food, we're
mm.
very much in the same place.
Yeah,
I
there's a
don't think we can afford to wait 40, 50 more years to get that out
no.
there. It's people like you and me who are trying to tell the truth about it, I think.
Yeah, and I think to draw a parallel outside of healthcare, it's and medicine, it's climate change as well. We're looking in the news this week, and there's been a new report out which has told us everything we knew. Was we've been seeing I turn 40 next year, and we've been talking about climate change my entire life. It's not a new thing, but it's this kind of, when do we accept it and when do we actually do something about it, is you know it's the same thing that's going on in all these areas. And talking about the smoking, I'm sure you're aware of it, Graham, but there's a fantastic paper which I need to dig out and I'll post it to the group, which is all about the industry playbook of big big tobacco,
Yeah,
and how it's very, very similar to what the kind of food and pharmaceutical industries roll out on a routine basis. And it was interesting. I'm sure you guys saw the news the other week when Ronaldo moved the Coke and
yeah,
all that kind of stuff, and the instant response from Coca-Cola was all about personal choice, and people have got a choice to drink what they want, which is exactly what big
yeah.
tobacco used as their argument, wasn't it? So they
Absolutely.
still
But
do.
what makes me so angry is the way that medical research has been polluted, particularly by Coke, actually.
Mm,
They set up all these foundations and paid scientists to produce certain outcomes and then literally polluted medical research.
mm,
And the
mm.
other thing that makes me as angry, and I guess the person who's probably the easiest to watch, Ben Goldacre's TED talk about bad science,
Mm,
in
mm.
which he realizes that as a GP, you haven't got time to go back and look at all the original papers. You just
Yes.
get a distillation.
Yeah.
Turns out that although this has improved recently, most drug trials are industry sponsored. And
Mhm.
if the drug doesn't show the result that it should, then it just gets buried.
Mm.
And he kind of imputed and then proved that most of the research goes missing. So only the positive trials are ever produced.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
And so when you're acting as a pharmacist or a prescriber on the basis of the available evidence,
Mm.
you're not seeing the available evidence, you're seeing a subset that's been polluted.
Mm. And so, yeah, because this is why we have compulsory registration of clinical trials these days to
Yeah,
try and overcome this bias. I'm sure there's still kind of lots of stuff that goes on behind the scenes to do this, but you know, look at the statins and you see a very overwhelmingly positive bias.
yeah,
When you look at it by date, they just stopped doing the research at that point.
yeah.
And the only two publicly funded statin trials showed no real effect from statins. All it's only the positive ones are from industry sponsored thing.
It's interesting. If you, I mean, I'm not anti-drug,
Mm,
as in, it becomes a cult or a religion. I'm
yeah,
just anti the excess and inappropriate use of drugs.
yeah.
And to get it in context, the UK drugs bill is about 20 billion. The entire community pharmacy network costs less than 3 billion. And if we were to take some of the money that we're spending on drugs and invest it in community pharmacy, but in healthy living pharmacy, in other words, pay community pharmacy more to do public health interventions and then save the money on the drugs. I kind of, where I've got to is I don't actually now any longer believe that the NHS is underfunded, which is what I believe for most of my professional life.
Mm,
I just think the money's being spent in the wrong way because of all these biases that go on.
mm, mm. Absolutely. I think a real radical overhaul of the NHS, we would actually, save ourselves huge amounts of money.
Yeah.
It's just, it's just the from here to there is quite a significant jump, isn't it? But
Lots of
yeah.
vested interests. I mean, I think the vested interests of big food and big pharma make tobacco look like nothing.
Oh, completely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, so interesting that it's a very UK based example. I know you guys are all UK based, but
Mm.
here at the moment, but obviously, this will be watched in the future and by people from outside of the UK. But we had a big report a few weeks ago into food and this, and one of the key strategies was recommending taxation, and within hours the prime minister had said, well, I don't think we need to be taxing hardworking people anymore. And it was I tried to keep away from politics in this, and it's not a political issue. It's the fact
Yeah.
that food companies and pharmaceutical companies pay colossal amounts of taxation money to the government, way more than in corporation tax, way more than kind of us as individual taxpayers and stuff will. So the government to a certain extent is not going to bite the hand that feeds it. So it's a huge problem.
I only go so far down the track with that one, Dan. I understand the
Mm,
argument, but let me put the contra argument to you,
mm,
is by subsidising cheap food, we end up picking up the bill through the NHS much more expensively
mm,
ultimately,
yeah.
and in terms of productivity. And I actually think there's a reverse argument to that, which is if we were all healthier and longer lived and needed.
Mm,
And I don't want to come across as knocking the NHS. Worked in the NHS all my life. I'm a
yeah.
passionate supporter of it. But
Mm.
I just think we need to have a radical rethink about all these relationships and where the money flows are.
Definitely. Yeah, it's just the time lag between implementing that and the tax bills that come in at the every quarter or however much.
Dan, and no one anticipated this when they brought in the smoking ban, and it was brought in Scotland before the UK.
Mm,
There was an overnight and radical drop in heart attacks,
mm,
and no one really understood it. And no one, because the Scottish population is a relatively small population, it was kind of, is it white noise? Is it really there? I mean, it was a huge and unexpected drop, and it happened within the year. And everyone was scratching their heads, and obviously there are theories about the damage. We know that smoking kills people over a long term, but by stopping a lot of people smoking rapidly, saving lives within the year, no one expected it. When they introduced the smoking ban in England, they got the same results, except on a much bigger scale. My point is, yes, they're getting less revenue from the cigarettes because there's less smoking, but look at the return on the investment in saving and cost of lives. And I think that model really does translate. And I think you could save the money. And I'm seeing it rapidly. I get my clients much healthier. They get them on a lot fewer drugs, and
Mm.
that would more than pay for my service. And I'm sure the same is equally true for you.
Yeah, absolutely, and we do see pretty rapid results with many people, and it is quite incredible. It's just convincing the mass population that sugar and stuff is more than just empty calories, really, and the vested interests are so vocal about choice and all this, very, that kind of seem on the face of it very obvious, simplistic arguments to a more complicated problem, really. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So yes, we. So I'm a big believer in kind of one person at a time, and that I know a lot of people who have these as I've become a great advocate, and actually we've got Dan Grief. You've done some interviews with Dan,
Yeah, great.
and Dan was a politician at one point, wasn't he?
He still is. He still hopes
Yeah.
at some point to be an MP. He lives in Cambridge, so yeah, that's his
Yeah,
plan.
so he's but interestingly, we're talking in a couple of months about from politician to podcaster to what drove him into kind of wanting to make change in this world. So yeah, that's going to be an interesting one. So that's coming up, not September, October. Oh, it might be September or October. Anyway, guys, watch this space. That's a new one.
Genuinely lovely guy, Dan Grief. I got to know him really well, and he's
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely decent bloke. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's going to be really, really interesting. So yeah, before we kind of try to put the worlds to right, it's going to be a while, but I completely, singing from the same proverbial hymn sheet as you on this one. Beyond food, beyond diet, where are we going?
Yeah. So just to be clear about the diet, it's the sugar, carbs, and the processed food, what I call the trifecta of evil that we
Yeah.
need to avoid.
Mm.
And you've got to be really careful. I always say to people, ignore the front of the pack because that's usually marketing bullshit. Just look at the back.
Mm.
And this is something I've learned from my friend and colleague Asim Malhotra.
Mm.
Look at the back of the pack, and if there's 5 things on it, some of which you've never heard, just put it back on the shelf.
Yeah.
Real food doesn't have that kind of thing.
No.
And I think 60 or 70% of healthy longevity is food. So what's the rest? Sleep. And I have become, my journey's been a bit like this actually. I used to want to be like Mrs. Thatcher, not from a political perspective, you understand,
Yeah.
but she was
Yeah.
famous for only needing 3 hours sleep.
Yeah.
Do you remember what she died of?
I don't actually. No.
Dementia.
Okay. Yeah.
You know who her busy mate was, sort of a political point of view?
Bit before my time, I'm afraid, Graham. I'm
Reagan.
glad to say.
Reagan.
Yeah.
And he was also, there were a huge bravado about sleep.
Right.
Do you know what he died of?
Dementia.
Exactly.
Mm.
And in my formative years, I was very gung ho about sleep because I thought there's plenty of time to sleep when you're dead.
Mm.
The truth is, you will be dead.
Yeah.
And you'll be dead much sooner. And so I've completely reversed myself on sleep now that I understand the science.
Mm. Mm.
To give everyone a sense of how important sleep is, if you think of the whale, now the whale is a mammal, it has to come up for air. And if the whale fell asleep at the bottom of the ocean, it would die. So the whale sleeps with one side of the brain and then the next.
Mm.
And the same is true of migratory birds on the flight, when on the wing for days on end, they do the same thing.
Mm.
Turns out not only do we sleep as organisms, not only do our individual cells within us sleep, but even the organelles, the parts of cells themselves sleep.
Mm.
And our microbiome changes quite radically during our sleep.
Mm.
I basically always say to my clients that if you're not prioritizing sleep, you're building your castle on sand.
Mm.
It's of such fundamental importance to your cardiometabolic health, your mental health, absolutely every aspect of it. And yet it gets ignored. And, here's a typical thing, you go to your doctor and the doctor says, oh yeah, you've got your test back, Mr. Bloggs. Cholesterol's a bit high. Take a statin, come and see me in a month. You go back in a month and he says, yeah, a bit better. Blood pressure's a bit high. Here's an antihypertensive, come back and see me in a month.
Mm.
Go back there and he said, well, we're just going to up the dose a bit. And as you're walking out the door of the surgery, you say, Doc, I'm not sleeping very well. And the
Mm.
doctor shrugs,
Yeah.
right? And that's not me criticizing doctors. It's because there is no drug. In fact, the evidence of the drugs for sleep do more harm than good.
Mm.
But it's not a priority. No health professional makes it a priority
Yeah.
until you discover how important it is and make it your own priority.
And indeed, it's so, and you know, having been on the other side of it as a GP,
Yeah.
you know, it is so difficult. We're so limited on time,
Yeah.
and I think one of the things that finally did me in was, you know, I love getting that patient who generally wants to talk about that kind of thing, and I'd end up half an hour late because it takes time to get into those conversations, to have that conversation about meaningful lifestyle change. It isn't something that can happen in a 10-minute appointment. And 2 minutes of that is the patient walking in and out of the room. You're reading the notes, you've got to type the notes up and stuff. So you're looking at 6 minutes at best. There's, you know, no time to take a decent conversation about sleep. So
I'm not, please don't think I'm coming across as criticizing my medical colleagues. I'm not. They're working in a system that drives their behavior and dictates how things are done.
Yeah, absolutely.
It almost dials out. And they're also driven to follow these prescribing protocols. That's how they make their living. And we as pharmacists the same.
Yeah.
I think I should be paid twice as much for not dispensing a drug as dispensing it.
Yes.
But I get paid nothing for not dispensing a drug.
Of course.
Which doesn't mean I won't do it. Of course, we're ethical, and first of all, we'll put patient interest first. But, you know, the drivers are all about finding symptoms and then suppressing them with drugs, and that's the way the system works.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons morale is so low, both in general practice medicine and in pharmacy, is we kind of know that's not right, but we kind of feel powerless to do anything about it.
Absolutely. No, it is an incredibly difficult thing to overcome. And I know, you know, from colleagues and stuff who, when they get interested in lifestyle, and because I teach, I train registrars, junior GPs who are in training and stuff.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm very fortunate. I actually get to spend quite a lot of time in a car driving around talking to them. Well, I used to before COVID, because I'm not allowed registrars at the moment, but soon. And you know, I end up talking about lifestyle medicine and stuff, and people are very excited about it, and younger doctors and stuff are really genuinely excited about the possibility of making meaningful change in their patients' lives through lifestyle interventions. But the general day-to-day stress and, you know, and it's increasing significantly at the moment with regards to lifestyle, to, you know, pressures of the job, and not even be able to physically see their patients anymore, you know, quickly, you know, puts that, you know, it's easier to be a doctor. And I speak as a doctor, you know, I'm open with my colleagues about that. It's easier to be a doctor who prescribes medication than it is to be a doctor who prescribes lifestyle medicine.
Well, I likewise, I train a lot of pharmacists, and I do talks for GPs, and I did a talk to a GP practice, and there were 2 GP registrars there. And I said to these fresh faced young things, how much training did you get on diet, sleep, nutrition, exercise? And they said, sleep, nothing, exercise, nothing, nutrition, a day. So we're not taught it.
No, we're not, even though, you know, the sleep thing seems to be quite apparent to me quite quickly. And I think this is, you know, I can't cheat sleep for long. And to the point where, you know, I have a 9-month-old daughter who thankfully over the last few weeks has started sleeping very, very well, but she's teething. And actually last night I did a late shift. I finished at midnight. I got in about half midnight, and she was up at 4 o'clock crying for about an hour because she was teething. Drugs can be useful in some situations, and a bit of Calpol at that point was useful. So
the parents should take the drugs.
But you know, and then she's up at 7 o'clock this morning. So an acute sleep deficit is very, very obvious to me. And I had to get half an hour on the floor of the office here this afternoon in order to function. And so yeah, and of course other drugs as well. So and so it's something that, but we do see people kind of pushing on chronically. So other people seem to have a greater tolerance for a sleep debt over time, really, don't they? So
I think people have got used to living their lives. A lot of my clients, we always, when we take people on, we provide them with a sleep questionnaire. And if anyone's interested, you can go to my website, download it, and have a go. And not only does it look at the amount of sleep, but it looks at your chronotype.
Yeah.
So it turns out that we're not all designed to, you could be an owl or lark or something in between. And there are 5 chronotypes. And it's probably all of this is evolutionary biology. So if you imagine that hunter-gatherers used to sleep in tribes. Now, if the whole tribe was asleep at the same time, they couldn't reproduce, they couldn't defend themselves, and they couldn't eat. So they probably slept in relays. And so your chronotype, whether you're a lark or an owl, is actually built in. And the nature of modern society forces you to be up in the office at a particular time, irrespective of your chronotype. And there's a fascinating experiment every year that 1.5 billion people do it every year. And as a result of this experiment, there's a 25% increase in suicides, heart attacks, and car accidents every year. You think we'd learn. Do you know what that experiment is?
No.
It's when the clocks go forward and then they go back.
Yeah, absolutely.
How powerful sleep deprivation is. And all of those statistics almost entirely reverse themselves when the clocks go the other way and we get the extra hour. And yet people just carry on and they don't realize.
No. Fascinating. Right. I'm just conscious of time because we want to have a little time for any questions, and Karen's put one up there. But what about exercise, Graham?
Yeah. So for me, the most important thing, particularly for men as we age, is retaining muscle. And it needs to be functional. And so probably dancing or gardening will do you far more benefit than an hour of low level cardio at the gym. And the example I always give, next time you're on an aeroplane, watch an older person trying to put their luggage into the locker above. And what you will find is they can pick it up and they'll get to this point and it's fine. As soon as it goes above head height, they're like this, right? And eventually someone stands up and shoves it into the locker, someone half their age, because they think either they're going to kill me or they're going to kill themselves. And it's because if you think about it, as we age, people never use their upper body, so no one's got any upper body strength. They've lost their core. They've lost their ability, sensitivity. And so I always say to people, just imagine an exercise that is the same as picking up your suitcase, lifting it over your head and chucking it in the locker.
Yeah.
Now what people do is they go to the gym and they do 20 minutes of low level exercise or a bit of walking. Yeah. But they sit on their bum for the rest of the time.
Yeah.
And as you'll notice, I've got a standing desk. So I always try and take my business calls standing up. I try and do things like this standing up.
Yeah.
And just the act of standing on itself has a huge benefit. Not just on the amount of calories that you burn, but also on your whole cardiovascular system, including cancer risk. Turns out prolonged sitting is as dangerous as smoking.
Yeah.
Maybe more so.
Yeah.
So I always encourage people to do exercise that's relevant and functional. And there are 2 or 3 things that are a good way of, measuring that. One is, can you get down on the floor without using your hands and get up again? Because that is lower body strength and balance. And your ability to do that or not do that is a huge predictor of your future well-being. Another one is the ability to stand with your eyes closed like that on one leg. and see how long you can do that for. And those two things will tell you a lot. So I always
Yeah,
try
so
to think,
very similar to one of the medical tests we do in terms, yeah, for yeah,
so I
yeah,
always say to people, by all means, do a bit of do some cardio. But I think what a lot of people think is A, they can outrun a bad diet, and B, if
mm,
they do lots and lots of cardio, that'll be fine, and it
yeah,
won't. It's on its own is not enough, and we're probably over prioritizing cardio type
yeah,
exercise
yeah.
and under prioritizing things that build muscle, and things that build muscle involve resistance.
Yeah. Yeah, it's yeah, because I think one of the things that I'm very lucky, very my job gives me is perspective across the life course, and I recall I saw a lady last night about 9 o'clock last night, 91-year-old, just moved into a nursing home, a care home, and I put my blood pressure cuff on this lady, and I could swear it was just bone.
Yeah.
And actually, the loss of muscle over the life course is, and this is why I'm a big passionate supporter of strength training. You guys know that I rumble on about squatting and all this kind of stuff, and
Absolutely.
function. But one of the things is about aging well. It is actually being able to have a functional musculoskeletal system
Yeah.
into your older years, and that starts as early, it starts as early as you can, really, doesn't it? So
Well, it's very interesting. So,
mm,
my favourite station, underground station, I think, it's either Covent Garden or I can't remember which one it is. It's got 179 steps.
mm,
And when I first tried to walk up that, it was like I got up the first 20 and I was just
mm,
dead. And now I run up the lot and
mm.
I run past all these 11-year-olds who never do
Yeah,
any exercise. I think, oh,
yeah,
that's easy. And these are kids.
yeah.
And they've got no cardiac reserve, no strength. They never do anything physical. They never move. And I kind of feel an old man of 62. I sprint past. I feel kind of good about it. But functional movement,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, Graham, that's been absolutely fantastic. I think in terms of time, let's have a jump onto some questions and stuff, if that's okay with you. And then we'll have a little bit of a finish up. I know you wanted to talk to me. So Karen says, how can you manage menopause with sleep? I think that's probably beyond the scope of this conversation, to be honest. I mean, it's menopause and sleep is a really, really difficult kind of area, really, because I know it's one of the things that really does go awry in menopause and stuff. So unless you've got something you want to jump in with, Graham.
Deep into it.
Mm,
I'll give an example. So one of my clients, she's aged 82, and she had what was seemed to be menopausal symptoms that had gone on for years. And she'd been to see her GP. The GP entirely reasonably prescribed HRT. She didn't get on with it.
mm,
And she'd had terrible sleep for 20 years, woke up every night with night sweats.
mm.
Got the continual blood glucose monitor on her. And
Ah,
actually what we found is her problem wasn't estrogen or progesterone, it was insulin.
mm,
And what she was having was a profound reactive hypoglycemia.
yeah, yeah,
When you go hypo, you get very similar symptoms
mm,
to the sort of symptoms that menopausal women get. And once we got her off all the sugary, carby foods and stabilized her insulin, her
mm,
weight came down
mm,
quite rapidly. Her blood pressure came down because she's
mm,
on quite a high dose of antihypertensives.
mm.
And she's now got the best sleep she's had in 20 years.
Fantastic.
So sleep and food,
Yeah.
menopause, I'm not
Mm,
saying that that's a magic bullet, and it's,
mm.
none of these things are magic bullets, but I tell you, you can make one hell of a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So that's a really interesting, what we thought wasn't there. David's just come back on. David's got a great question. I know it's something we've talked about, myself and David have talked about. David's saying, do you suggest that one should take control of one's own medication? I ask as a type 2 diabetes person who has lost a lot of weight, but is still on metformin, plus ramipril, atorvastatin, amlodipine. doctor agrees you're in remission, but I know, and David, feel free to unmute yourself. I know your doctor is really reluctant to take you off these medications. I think we've talked about that it being a very kind of potentially quite paternalistic way of practicing medicine,
Right.
and that a shared care kind of a shared discussion making approach would be very, very appropriate here. But what are your thoughts as the pharmacist, Graham?
So I have lots of clients in exactly the same circumstances. And one of the things as an absolute, imperative for me is not to damage the relationship between my client and their own GP. But equally, I'm not frightened to challenge. And what I will often do is provide them with a load of information. For what we do with blood pressure, we monitor it forensically. So typically, I will get my clients to get a blood pressure monitor with a Bluetooth that they can then upload the data. It's about 20 quid, 30 quid. And we will take their blood pressure in both arms twice a day. Because a single reading at a single time of day tells you very little about someone's ongoing blood pressure. And if I can see a consistent healthy trend, I'll get them to put it in an Excel spreadsheet and share it with their doctor to give the doctor the confidence to prescribe.
Which ironically, Graham, is the nice guidelines on how we do this as well, isn't it? It's not
at whatever time of day, they take your blood pressure because they're under pressure. Take the single reading or a couple of readings in one arm, and again, it's time constraints, but if you've got a decent blood pressure monitor at home, you can do that for yourself, and you can do it. So that gives you the evidence is that's pretty much as good as 24-hour ambulatory monitoring. So that's one way of doing it. And then the statin things. Well, I just send. It's a particular favourite of mine is David Diamond's presentation on, which I'm happy to share. We can put it into the show notes on statins. And so what I try to do is, I never say to my clients, just unilaterally withdraw from your drugs. But I always say to them, look, ultimately it's your body and you can make decisions. We're here to advise you, but we're not your parents that tell you what you have to do. And I present the evidence to them, hope that they'll have an informed discussion with their GP, and then they can make a decision. And so many of my clients now are withdrawing from statins, sometimes with the agreement of their GP and sometimes with the disagreement of their GP, but the informed consent. But ultimately, it's up to you. David,
I would add that during these times of COVID, I've only been able to have phone conversations, so it's more difficult to have a convincing argument with the GP, of course.
Yes and no. So you can email them stuff. Obviously, if they haven't seen your bloods, then that's different. But as long as you can get your bloods done, which should be feasible now.
That's been done.
I always do look at the biometric markers. So we'll look at the lipids, we'll look at HbA1c, we'll look at liver function tests. And if all of that and your blood pressure is good and you're sleeping well, then you can be typically you can be diabetes in remission. The GP can log that, and then it's just a question of regular monitoring.
It's
my driver for this whole thing. So
it's moving to an informed conversation about these kind of things, really. And I think I'm a big believer that you should come to a shared decision making with a patient about a plan forward. And it's underpinned general practice training for a good number of years now, this thing, and it tends to be older GPs or overstressed GPs who are less good at that. So but it's definitely I know you've never seen your GP face to face, so you don't actually know. We've talked about this, haven't we? But cool. Okay, I hope that helps, David. Right, so I think you wanted to ask me a few questions, didn't we? Because this is being shared with your community as well. So, go for it.
Yeah. So, Dan, your background, as you said, you've done genetics, qualified as a medic. You've been a GP. Are you still GPing, or is it?
Yep. Still GP, yeah, but I don't do in hours general practice anymore. I only do out of hours, and my full in hours focus is promoting what we've been talking about. Yeah, so the kind of
Everyone in this space has their own personal. I'd like to say that everyone in this space is basing their practice on evidence and their training. Well, and it's actually not the case. So I've explained in my case that what I thought I knew turns out to have been wrong, and then the evidence in my own eyes made me challenge, the orthodoxy and reach completely different conclusions. And I just wanted to know what your journey's been, because I you've had a somewhat similar journey.
Yeah, and so so many things about the things you spoke to me about earlier, Graham, were really interesting parallels. And I apologize to you guys who've heard this story before, but basically, I struggle with my weight as long as I can remember. I don't ever remember being slim. I don't ever remember being particularly sporty at school. I was probably always the kind of back marker in the things last to be picked at sport, that kind of stuff. So, it was didn't come from a particularly sporty family or anything like that. So parents who just worked pretty hard and tried to do their best with the knowledge they had at that time. But I wound up in my kind of in my mid-20s with significant weight gain, and how many times I tried the kind of the calorie restricted, eat less, move more approach for to be successful in the short term, because it usually is successful in the short term, but only to be kind of back where I was, avoiding the scales, self-worth taking a real significant hit every single time as well, because putting it down to a failure of willpower. Even had a really good success on a low carbohydrate diet at one point, but it was actually a comment from a colleague who said, "Oh, you want to watch your cholesterol eating all that red meat," that actually put me off at a time. And so I was actually skiing in 2016, and I saw a guy at the table opposite me with shared chalet spooning butter into his coffee. And I'd kind of heard about bulletproof coffee and that at that time, but I'd kind of dismissed it as nonsense. Interviews with Dave Asprey and things I'd heard, but kind of thought this guy's a complete quack. I started up a conversation with this guy, and he basically reframed it as from calories in, calories out, to looking at it as a hormonal problem. Oh my goodness, didn't that just make a whole lot of sense, to look at weight gain and weight loss as a hormonal problem rather as an energy balance problem? And as soon as I got back from that holiday, I was 108.5 kilograms with a BMI of 32.5 or something like that. So I was officially obese. 6 months later, I dropped under the BMI of 25, and I maintained it ever since. So, and very much like you, Graham, I started researching the fundamental science, became an accidental academic GP overnight. And obviously went through the kind of the low carb side of things, the insulin side of things, but inevitably ended up in the cholesterol thing, because I'm thinking, okay, this is working for me, but am I causing myself more problems down the line? Became a statin skeptic, and and fully awakened kind of GP. But I was working in a dispensing practice at the time as my first year out of training, and I was taking people off their metformin, David, and the next day the senior partner was ringing them to put them back on it, and so it became an unsustainable position to me to be in this GP practice. And the other partner in that practice was lovely, was very responsive to my ideas, but because of quaff and the general practice stuff, the stuff that made them money, she was still going ahead and doing all the same things that she'd just been sitting at lunch telling me were she didn't agree with and stuff. So I had to get myself out of there. So I put my resignation in. And then I started the YouTube channel shortly afterwards, because I wanted to try and actually be part of the solution rather than part of the continuing to be part of the problem as I saw it.
And I have to say that's a bold and brave thing to do, Dan, because I mean, okay, you were younger in practice. I'd practiced for 25 years at the top of my profession. You could hardly have been more senior. And to turn around at the end of 25 years and think, I've been getting it all wrong.
Mm.
That's not an easy thing.
No.
And you'll know that medicine is quite hierarchical. And all this sort of stuff, calories in, calories out, statins, all of this stuff, it's a bit like challenging gravity. You're never going to do it. So you come to a realization, and then you're in an emotional, in a kind of ethical cleft stick. And I think a lot of people just burn out and just carry on. Well, that's the system. I can't change the system.
Mm.
And then there's enough of us now who I think are challenging that and starting a whole new approach, call it, lifestyle medicine or integrative medicine, or I don't know what your preferred term is. I think we're going to change the world. We just need to change it a lot more quickly.
Yeah. And I think, it was just so important to get, I just couldn't continue sitting there doing the same thing and fighting the same battles every day, and knowing I'm genuinely not doing any good for, I don't think I was doing that amount of good for people really. So and I'm very grateful. I've obviously got a lovely group of people who have had some actually fantastic results, but also I get great messages on YouTube from people who have, I've got one guy who went from 190 kilograms down to, and he just broke under 100, it's the weight loss was a primary motivating factor for him, but his health has overwhelmingly improved as a result of that. So it's great to have all these these stories and stuff, and I'm just getting started with the YouTube channel. I've just moved into this new office here, so we can actually have a permanent camera set up, and that Tessa, who you've met, and Claire, who's you may have come across at conferences as well, helping me writing for the YouTube channel and stuff. So we're just getting started with that really.
Well, there's plenty out there, there's plenty of work for all of us. And I, Dan, sincerely, I wish you every success. You could have just carried on, which is what most of us do. I could have carried on just dispensing the statins and earning my income that way. You could have carried on as a GP, just following the protocols. Challenging the orthodoxy is always difficult. But
I think especially as a junior doctor, as very young doctor, because like you say, it's very hierarchical. And we all know of David Unwin, and I'm sure many of you have come across David Unwin. And Jen, his wife, has been on on as one of these talks and stuff. David's a very, very senior partner in his practice and has been able to really implement change. It's not easy as a junior doctor relatively junior doctor to do that. So
no, I think that's right. I tell you what, for me, when you start to practice this way and you see the results, it's simply impossible to unsee it. And it's impossible to continue to practice in the old paradigm. I just literally find it impossible. And, we all come into medicine. If you don't come into medicine, wanting to do good for people, you're in the wrong job.
Yeah, absolutely.
And much as I won all these awards and, you get people's blood pressure under control and you treat to target and all those things, I never particularly felt that good about it. And then 8 to 12 weeks with my new longevity program, it's not the weight loss really, it's the light coming back into people's eyes. It's the exuberance of youth and enthusiasm and joie de vivre. And it's just so incredibly sustaining. There's no way I could go back now. It would just be impossible for me.
Yeah, it's a much nicer way of practicing medicine for me. So yeah, absolutely. Thanks, David. Cool. Brilliant. I've got the coaching call to do after this, so we've got some questions. But Graham, absolutely lovely to have you here. I love these talks to bring some different perspectives from other people, and I learned so much because I've been so busy, kind of delving my head into YouTube and all this kind of stuff, and it's great for me to be able to pick people's brains, who have read into different areas and learnt different areas. So I genuinely can't wait to get back to some sort of conferences when they start up again, because they're absolutely great for those kind of things, really. So and I'm sure we'll meet in person at some point at one of these.
You're also, like me, involved with the public health collaboration.
Yeah.
And I've paid for the conference that never happened, and I've never asked for my money back. So when the next one comes,
Yeah.
are you there?
Yeah, absolutely, I'll be there. So, yeah, I had, Sam was the very first guest this year on with his talking about his organ meats and organuary and stuff, which is another fascinating area we can go down. But yeah, he was talking at that point about hopefully potentially doing one towards the end of this year in person. Yep. I don't know how that's what his plans are at the moment.
Still on at the moment.
So yeah, that's exciting. Yes, brilliant. Right. Thank you, Graham. Really, really much appreciated. And I know everybody here is very, very grateful for you to coming on and talking to us this evening. And I look forward to meeting you in person in the future.
It's been a joy, and thanks for having me.
Take care, Graham. Bye-bye.
Bye all.